Well, you weren't complying at that time. It took the United States Supreme Court to order you to comply, so you hadn't proactively complied on your own. You were intending to wrongfully deport people without access to a court hearing, without access to the rule of law, and that is why it was necessary for the United States Supreme Court,
process does not guarantee a hearing.
who issued an opinion ordering you and your agency to comply with the due process rights of the people in this country. That's what makes our country great, is we do have access to due process. And so my comment to you is I'm hoping as you move forward, because initially as you were proceeding through these deportation processes, you were not affording people due process, and the Supreme Court has now ordered you to do so. So I am assuming by your testimony that you do intend to comply with the Supreme Court's order moving forward, and we're not going to have any more instances of wrongful deportation without proper access to due process.
This may look like a heated exchange between a lawmaker and a cabinet secretary, but it's actually a stress test of how power behaves when legal limits get in the way. What's really being tested here is whether executive agencies see constitutional safeguards as obligations or obstacles. This raises broader questions about how easily due process can be sidelined in the name of enforcement. In this video, we'll break down how this moment reveals a deeper conflict between authority and accountability inside the federal system.
Questions?
Thank you so much, Mr.
Texas
Chairman.
to Texas.
And thank you, Madam Secretary, for appearing before our committee today. I want to address several issues. I'm going to try not to repeat a lot of issues that have been addressed, but I do have some substantial concerns over how ICE agents present themselves to the public. Oftentimes, we've seen many videos out there where they're masked and not properly identified. I have a lot of real personal concern about that. I just put myself in the situation of that woman from Tufts, for example. You're just walking down the street, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, 3 masked men, not properly identified, attack you and try to take you away. I find that to be reprehensible and not the values of this country. What steps are you taking to make sure that your ICE agents are not masked and properly identified when they approach someone?
Well, ICE agents always identify themselves to individuals that they're encountering or that they're working with. What I would say as far as if they are wearing something over their faces, it's oftentimes because that agent has been involved in undercover operations or needs to be able to continue the investigative work that they do on a day-to-day basis.
But don't you think, Madam Secretary, that people have a right to see whoever's trying to apprehend them? I think it's creating this unrealistic vigilante system. And are you aware that your materials, ICE agents, jackets and the sorts, are available on Etsy for $20? Anybody can do that, throw a mask on, and run around and terrorizing people of color without any regard for the law, without any regard, because your agency does not have proper protocols to make sure their agents are clearly identified and marked when they're executing their jobs.
Our agents do identify themselves. They verbally do that, and then also by the clothing that they're wearing. And if they do have something that is covering some of their facial features, it's for their investigative work or their undercover work that they do as a part of their job duties as well. What I would say is that it is important that we follow the procedures and protocols for every encounter that we have, and they have done that in every situation to the best of my knowledge.
I would suggest that your protocols need to be revised, because I don't think it's reasonable for masked men to be apprehending people on the streets. I think that instills a lot of fear. It doesn't instill security in the process. And in states like Texas, that is open carry, when any jackadoo can be walking around with a gun. I think some tragic circumstances are at bay. I'd like to switch gears to due process. I have a lot of concerns about the lack of due process that your agency has been affording people in this country. In Texas, for example, you had rounded up 171 individuals, were preparing to deport them, and it wasn't until the Supreme Court issued an opinion that that was unconstitutional and that their due process rights were being violated did your agency actually stop and adhere to the Supreme Court's opinion. My question to you is, has those efforts ceased in your agency? Are you going to cease trying to deport people without access to due process in the courts of law in compliance with the United States Supreme Court?
Well, Congresswoman, we are following due process and using it as to how Congress has laid out to us in statute, and we are complying with all federal judges' orders as well.
You weren't complying at that time. It took the United States Supreme Court to order you to comply, so you hadn't proactively complied on your own. You were intending to wrongfully deport people without access to a court hearing, without access to the rule of law, and that is why it was necessary for the United States Supreme Court,
due process does not guarantee a hearing,
who issued an opinion ordering you and your agency to comply with the due process rights of the people in this country. That's what makes our country great, is we do have access to due process. And so my comment to you is I'm hoping as you move forward, because initially as you were proceeding through these deportation processes, you were not affording people due process, and the Supreme Court has now ordered you to do so. So I am assuming by your testimony that you do intend to comply with the Supreme Court's order moving forward, and we're not going to have any more instances of wrongful deportation without proper access to due process. Is that correct?
We are following federal judges' orders, and we are complying with due process
Well, we look
procedures
forward to
as
that.
they are laid out, as Congress has given us those tools to do that.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I have one other question about FEMA. I'm very concerned about the destruction of FEMA. You know, Texas is a state that has a lot of hurricanes, tornadoes, and natural disasters. We rely upon FEMA extensively, and I'm very worried about that. And when you are governor, though, you actually utilized FEMA for your own state. So you did recognize at the time when you were serving as a governor that FEMA played an important role in natural disasters within South Dakota. Is that correct?
Yes, we had 12 FEMA-related disasters during the 6 years I served as governor of the state of South Dakota.
But I just find it, I'm
agencies-
running out of time, but I just find it ironic.
I now recognize Mr. Pfluger, the gentleman from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In that charged moment inside the committee room, when Congresswoman Julie Johnson looked directly at Secretary Kristi Noem and warned that anyone with $20 and an online shopping cart could make themselves look like a federal agent, something far deeper than a policy dispute cracked open. It was not just about jackets sold on a website or masks worn in the field. It was about whether authority in America still comes from law, or whether it is slowly being replaced by fear, confusion, and unaccountable power. Johnson did not speak in abstractions. She spoke in human terms. She described what it would feel like to walk down the street and suddenly be confronted by masked figures, not clearly marked, claiming the right to take you away. She didn't frame it as a partisan attack. She framed it as a question of values. Are these really the values of this country? And when she pointed out that the same gear worn by federal officers can be bought online for the price of a cheap dinner, the implication was chilling. If anyone can look like the government, then the government no longer looks like anything at all. Secretary Noem responded with the language of procedure. She said agents identify themselves verbally. She said face coverings are used for undercover or investigative work. She said protocols exist and are followed. But in that exchange, something subtle happened. The conversation shifted from what is written on paper to what people experience in real life. And in that gap between official policy and lived reality, trust begins to erode. Because in a democratic society, law enforcement does not just enforce, it signals, it communicates legitimacy. Uniforms, badges, visible identification, these are not just accessories. They are symbols that tell the public this action is grounded in law, not whim. When those symbols become blurred, or when they can be imitated by anyone with an internet connection, the entire structure of accountability begins to wobble. Johnson's warning about a vigilante system was not hyperbole. It was a recognition of how fragile public order becomes when the line between authorized power and impersonation fades. In states where people are already legally allowed to carry weapons openly, she argued, the combination of masked figures and unclear authority becomes more than unsettling. It becomes dangerous in a way that threatens everyone, not just those being targeted. But the hearing did not stop there. It moved with deliberate force into an even more foundational issue: due process. Johnson reminded the room that in Texas, 171 individuals were nearly removed from the country without access to court review until the Supreme Court intervened. That was not a hypothetical concern. That was a documented moment where the highest court in the land had to step in to stop the executive branch from proceeding, and that is where the hearing became something else entirely. Because due process is not just a legal technicality. It is the core promise of the American system. It is the idea that before the government can take away your liberty, it must answer to an independent court. It must prove its case. It must be checked. When Johnson told Noem that it took a Supreme Court order to bring her agency into compliance, she was pointing to a truth that should trouble every citizen, regardless of political leanings. If agencies only follow the law when they are forced to by judges, then the balance of power envisioned by the Constitution is already under strain. Noem insisted her department was now complying. She said they were following federal court orders and using due process as laid out by Congress. But Johnson pressed her on the past. You were going to proceed anyway, she said. You were going to move forward until the court told you to stop. And that matters. Because it reveals how close the system came to crossing a line that should never be crossed in a free society. The exchange laid bare a deeper tension in American governance. On one side, a drive for efficiency, control, and enforcement. On the other, a constitutional framework built deliberately to slow things down, to force justification, to protect individuals from the overwhelming power of the state. When those two collide, the question is not just who wins a policy argument. The question is which vision of America survives. Even the later discussion about FEMA, briefly raised before Johnson's time expired, carried the same undertone. Texas, she noted, depends on federal disaster assistance. So did South Dakota when Noem was governor. Institutions matter when people need them. They become invisible when everything is calm, but indispensable when crisis strikes. Dismantling or weakening them may seem ideological in the abstract, but it becomes painfully concrete when a storm hits or when a family needs help to rebuild. What this hearing revealed, in its own quiet and tense way, is that America is standing at a crossroads of governance. One path leads toward a system where power is exercised with maximum force and minimum transparency. The other leads back to a vision of government restrained by law, visible in its actions, and accountable to the people it serves. Julie Johnson's questions were not just aimed at Kristi Noem. They were aimed at all of us. Do we accept a future where authority hides behind masks, where due process is optional until a court steps in, and where institutions are weakened in the name of ideology? Or do we insist that the government live up to the standards it claims to defend? Because in the end, the strength of a nation is not measured by how quickly it can act, but by how faithfully it honors its principles when it does. Transparency, accountability, the rule of law. These are not obstacles. They are the foundation. And moments like this, uncomfortable, tense, unscripted, are where those foundations are tested. What was said in that room will echo far beyond the hearing. It will echo in courtrooms, in communities, and in the quiet calculations of officials who now know they are being watched. That is why this matters. That is why you are watching. Support our work to expose the truth. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.